Good morning, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of English 2035. We're going to kind of dive into the work of the course, the work that is ahead of us for the semester. We're going to start with kind of just some basic discussion of some tacitly rudimentary critical ideas. Um, when you are thinking more deeply about fiction, there is always a discussion that hinges around the relationship between the text and the world around it. And we will certainly get to that, but today we're going to start off with a little bit of a discussion about the relationship between the author and its audience. The role of author intent when it comes to being a critic and when it comes to being a critical deep reader of fiction is one that is sort of endlessly slippery, if you will. And this week's discussion is more or less about just what do you think the role of authorial intent is, and what is the what is the place of it in your enjoyment of a text? I feel like a lot of times what puts people off about reading, especially what puts people off about reading in an English class, is that idea of a text being this kind of puzzle that you have to solve. This text that contains hidden meanings that are intentionally vague and elusive, and the goal of an English class like this one is to get you to sort of recognize and identify and then answer correctly on a test and move on. The goal of this class is more or less to enhance the joy of reading for each student. And in addition to learning some critical concepts and some key details about fiction generally, it's much more about trying to deepen one's understanding of what a text can do and what a text is doing. And so when it comes to authorial intent, there's this kind of struggle that a lot of people may have if it feels like the author is trying to say things without just straight up saying them, without simply stating out loud what their meaning is, what they're trying to get across, such and so forth. And so the two texts that are going to be sort of central to your discussion of the story that we'll read this week, and thus your discussion post conversations, it's two texts that more or less speak about the different weights of what the author intends and what the reader gets out of it. On the one hand, you have Guy de Maupassant. I always struggle when I say that name out loud, no matter how many times I rehearse it. But he was a critic and an author in the late 19th century. And then you have a much more recent text, if you will. It's a video from a series called Crash Course. You may or may not have stumbled upon Crash Course videos in your exploring of YouTube, but this one is specifically about how and why we read. In fact, that's the title of it. It's by a man named John Green, who has done, Crash Course videos on all sorts of things and concepts, with particular attention being paid around the midpoint of the video when he gets to what he calls the open letter section, where he directly addresses what he sort of sees as the importance of authorial intent. On the one hand, as you read the text, you'll see that Maupassant is very kind of rigid on the idea of what it means to be a serious writer. And when he speaks about what writers are trying to accomplish, he's also speaking to the idea of authorial intent. He is essentially making the argument, as you read, that serious writers are trying to capture little sort of microcosms of life. And in doing so, through all the weeding out of details, whatever it is that is most compelling to the story, that's the part of life that you sort of capture, and you leave out other details. But he also speaks to this idea of characters, and how stories don't usually start with like a a good plot or an exciting adventure, it starts with taking a character and examining a period in their life. And in doing so, you are examining all the things in that character's life that sort of go into these moments, and all the economic, all the social, all the political factors, and so on. So many, like myriad factors that make a person who they are and make a person do what they do, make a character do what they do. It's just this web of complex interactions and connectivity and conditioning and just all these things. And the goal of a serious writer is to kind of explore the character's life while simultaneously showing the reader these myriad things, putting them on display, not necessarily like overtly. He does mention early on that the author should be subtle so that a reader doesn't know that that's what's happening. But in a sense, the reader will then absorb what the author is saying about that character's life and all the factors that go into making that character who they are and making them react the way they do. On the other hand, you have John Green, who basically begins that section of the video by saying the author doesn't matter. And the crux of why he believes that the author doesn't matter is because there's such a gulch that exists between author and reader, and sometimes that sort of distance between author and reader can be the span of hundreds of years. If we read Shakespeare, Shakespeare is dead for 500 years now, almost 400 years at least, and his point is that it's an author can do whatever they can do to convey what they feel, to sort of tell the reader what's going on, to show the reader the importance of this moment, to really impress upon them what it is that they want to get across. But the reader being their own entity, not the same person, not acquainted with the person, not necessarily even alive at the same time as that person, there just may be disconnectivity that leads the reader to see things that aren't there, or to miss things that the author really wanted to get across at the time of writing. And John Green's point ultimately is that's okay. That's kind of the joy of doing it. You know, whether or not he uses the example of Great Gatsby, whether or not F. Scott Fitzgerald, intended for that green symbol to mean longing and lust and ambition and frustration at possibly never getting what you long for. That may come across to a reader, it may not. It may be that other symbols within that text are much more powerful and more important when it comes to that reader's experience of the text. And even if it's as close as it can get, this is extraneous to what John Green was kind of saying, but it is, a matter of critical theory. The slipperiness of words is so tricky to navigate. If someone were to be, not necessarily as detailed, but just to describe a tree or a cat or a car, unless they are giving you like dimensions and measurements and colors and, smells of these things, what the author intended when he or she wrote down tree may not necessarily be the same tree that I picture. And in essence, John Green's point is none of this necessarily ruins reading for the reader. The point of reading is to understand people better, to be more empathetic, and to sort of witness their expression of themselves in the hopes that, one, they can, just sort of learn and understand about people who aren't them, but also perhaps be able to better express themselves. The reader to be able to better express themselves when and if it comes to it, when and if the opportunity arises. So that's kind of the nature of the discussion, and we are hinging our discussion around one of my favorite stories to use in a classroom, which is George Saunders' Puppy. There is a link to the original New Yorker article. It was originally published in the New Yorker, and there's a link to the original story. Puppy is a very straightforward but also somewhat complex story. It contains two perspectives, not necessarily two narrators. The narrator is third person, all the other stuff with the notes about just sort of basic elements of fiction. The narrative voice in Puppy is always third person, but it switches in terms of perspective from this woman named Callie and this other woman named Marie, and how they encounter each other when Marie's family wants to acquire a puppy and Callie has a puppy to get rid of. If you've read the story before, great. The goal of the discussion is not necessarily to hinge around just summarizing the story or analyzing symbols. It's more or less to sort of use it as a ball with which to bat around these ideas of whether or not it's more important for the author's intent to get across, whether something is lost if that intent and that meaning is not apprehended, or whether or not the reader, regardless of whether or not they get the intended meaning, can still find something in the story to enjoy and to make personal, and thus enhance their understanding about who these characters are. And so that's the gist of this week's work. It is one discussion post and a couple of articles and a story. If you have any questions about the goal of this discussion, I am available for discussion. Send me an email. Do whatever you need to do to reach out. I have enjoyed reading some of the discussion posts that were posted for this week, and look forward to the discussion that takes place over the next week. So enjoy Puppy. Enjoy those two articles. Have fun debating authorial intent in the discussion post, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Until then, see you next week.